Welcome to our third class in this particular series. We are studying the S'dei Chemed, which gave a whole introduction in the first class, and we are in the middle of a very long, an extremely long section with regards to the topic of shiurim, measurements, with regards to Bnei Noach. We're in the middle of the middle. We're actually still towards the beginning. I'm not going to review everything in detail. For that, you need to refer back to the last class. Let me just remind everyone in very general terms the subject matter and the discussion. When it comes to prohibitions, and for that matter, actually for fulfilling mitzvahs, commandments, so for the Jewish people, there are many very specific, very particular measurements: volume, size, weight, length, different measurements. And for the most part, they are biblical, meaning it's not rabbinic, although they're not written in the Torah, in the Bible explicitly. But all of these measurements, for the most part, I should say, fall under the category of what we call halakha l'Moshe mi Sinai, that it was orally given over to Moses by God Almighty, and he passed it on from generation to generation. And for those that are familiar, so many things in the Jewish religion have to do with measurements, with such precision, so many details. For example, in order for a Jew to be liable for the punishment of transgressing by eating something which is forbidden to be eaten, which we call not kosher, in order to be punishable, he needs to have eaten a certain amount. Generally speaking, that amount is known as a kezayis. Roughly, it's about 1 ounce in volume. If he ate less than that amount, although he transgressed, it's considered a sin. He went against the command, the will of God. However, he does not get whatever the punishment would be, whether it would be the floggings, 39 lashes, whatever it may be. Question now is, does that apply in the world of the Ben Noach? For the Ben Noach, who transgresses, does he have these measurements? Or do we say that for a Ben Noach, any amount, the most minute amount, is not only forbidden, as it is for the Jew, but is actually punishable? No difference between the amount. And we're basing pretty much on a certain law that Maimonides says, the Rambam says, with regards to the Paschal offering. And then we have one commentary, known as the Tzlach, who gives a certain interpretation, and then there are those that argue, and we bring a proof from another writing of Maimonides, from his Sefer HaMitzvahs, from the book where he just lists the 613 commandments and devotes about a paragraph for each one of the commandments. So that's really where we're holding right now. And we're going to continue at this point from again, if you're using the standard S'dei Chemed that the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach worked on and republished, it's the Lubavitch publication of Kehos, and so we're in volume 8, Ches, and the page would be in the Hebrew numbers Aleph Taf Reish Zayin, 1607, and that's opposite the page which is numbered 3212. 2 columns on every page. We're on the left-hand column, bottom paragraph. The bottom of the left-hand column, which begins with the big word gam. So that's where we're at, and that is the discussion. And that's just a very, very brief synopsis of what we're talking about. Gam, also, befri megodim geir dea simen samach beis, b'mishpatzos, b'soif tiber maskov v'nistapakti. So there is a commentary on the commentary of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Jewish Code of Law. Shulchan Aruch, Jewish Code of Law. There is a very well-known commentary to the commentaries there, and the name of his book is the Pri Megadim. So in it's the section of his, and tells us exactly where to find it there. Kosav, he wrote as follows: Svaras HaRambam Hanal, the above mentioned understanding of Maimonides. V'shenire, and that it appears, Midivrei HaToisfes b'chulin daf lamed gimel lamed aleph dibra maschil echad. And so it appears to be the opinion of a commentary called the Toisfes, which is one of the primary commentaries, although the name itself implies secondary to Rashi. So Toisfes, which is on most every page of the Talmud, opposite the Rashi, is a compilation. Toisfes means additions. So it's a compilation of various different sages, their interpretation to the Talmud. So, in the tractate of Chulin, on 33a, Toisfes writes, it seems from Toisfes, the Savri that they hold, the Gam ben Noyach shi'ure b'chazayis, that for Ben Noyach, he too has the measurement of Kizayis. In order for him to be able to be punished for transgressing, for example, if the Ben Noyach ate that which he is forbidden to eat, Aver minachai, a part of an animal that was removed, detached, separated from the animal before the animal was dead, he's not allowed to eat that. So, in order for him to be able to get the punishment, he would need to eat the prescribed minimal amount of a kizayis, at least. V'siyem, and he concludes, the Pri Megadim concludes, V'da, and you should know, Shetam pluktasan, that the reason for their argument, Yesh loymar, we can say, the Tolui is dependent, the Mashakasa b'Mishneh Lamelech, B'ilches Chametz, Perek Aleph, halakha Zayin. The Mishneh Lamelech, which is one of the commentaries on Maimonides, in the laws of Chametz, he writes, Sharam Piresh Mechudash, Deloi Yoichal Bechol Shehu, V'ilchasa Afke Lemalkois Shehei Kezayis. Says like this, to remind you of the original case. It says that it's forbidden for certain people to participate, to eat from the Paschal offering. So in the verse it says, no foreigner can eat from it, no outsider, which means no non-Jew. And it says, separate prohibition, no arail, no uncircumcised, which means even a Jew that for whatever reason is uncircumcised, even if it's a legitimate reason, even if he's not allowed to be circumcised. But any male that's uncircumcised may not eat from the Paschal offering. Okay. Now it says, no outsider, no non-Jew. So then, Maimonides ruled that if a Jew feeds it to a non-Jew, the Jew is transgressing, and he would get the flogging. The problem is, the whole discussion here revolves around the fact that Maimonides says over there that if the Jew feeds a kezayis, that measurement, a kezayis, to the non-Jew. So wait a second, kezayis, non-Jew, who cares about the amount? Kezayis is only relevant for the Jew. In other words, if let's say an uncircumcised Jew ate half a kezayis of the Paschal offering, all right, then whatever the punishment is for such a person to eat, he wouldn't get the punishment. Understood. But the Ben Noyach, how does the kezayis come in? So that was the whole discussion. So we're saying, well, maybe for the Ben Noyach, even if he eats the tiniest amount, but in order for the Jew to transgress, he has the amount of a kezayis. And then we would say, no. Some say, from here we see that Maimonides at least holds that in order for the non-Jew to transgress or to get the punishment, he needs to also eat a kezayis. So that's what is revolving over here. So the Mishnah Melech says that this is a new law, a new interpretation, that he's not allowed to eat any amount, and in order to get the punishment, he's got to eat a kezayis. V'nislabe tamishna l'melech lefaresh masha amru biyuma koil l'rabis chatzishi or yun sham. And the Mishnah Lamelech is in doubt. He's groping with the idea to interpret that which it says in the Talmud, Tractate Yuma, that how do we know that less than a kezayis is actually forbidden for a Jew? The punishment is only if he ate a certain amount called a kezayis. How do we know that less than that is prohibited? Maybe less than that is not forbidden. If you don't get punished, then maybe it's not forbidden. Because there's a word that says kol, which means all or any. That extra word, kol, all, any, teaches us that for a Jew, whatever is forbidden, any amount is forbidden, even the smallest amount. Im kain, if so, ben noyach deleis lehilchasa. A ben noyach doesn't have this oral tradition of halakha l'moshe misina that we spoke about. That doesn't apply. That doesn't exist by the Noachides. Adarabba. So on the contrary, b'chol shu chayav, any amount, he would be liable for the punishment. Not to make this distinction that we make for the Jew. Any amount is forbidden. But in order to get punished, you have to eat a kezayis. No. For the Ben Noyach, any amount is forbidden, which means any amount is punishable. V'ilu, kfi hanire, mistama de Talmuda, b'chama b'koymis. However, the way it appears, in the straightforward, simple sense, from the Talmud in a number of places, ta'achila b'chezayis, v'hilchesa, rabba, l'chatzi shiur, li'isura. Then again, from the Talmud, in a number of places, it comes out, for a Jew at least, that in order to get punished, it's got to be this amount, this measure of a kezayis. And the prohibition, though, is any amount. Im kain, if so, leven noyach heter gamur hu b'chatzi shiur, at kan l'shoinoi. If so, for a ben noyach, on the contrary, anything less than a kezayis is absolutely permitted. So it's the opposite. In other words, we don't make this distinction by Bnei Noyach that any amount, forbidden, but not punishable until you eat the amount. Once you eat the amount, now you can get punished. That's only by the Jew. So now there's two ways to look at it by the Bnei Noyach. That either any amount is punishable, or until he eats a kezayis, not only he doesn't get punished, there's no prohibition for him. Because the word kol is written with regards to the Jew. It says the word kol. Which, that's the only way we know that whenever the Torah prohibits something for the Jew to eat, any amount is forbidden, even less than a kezayis. All right, so this is what he writes here, and likewise he writes in his commentary where he brings down the words of Tosfos. And now, says the S'dei Chemed. So we're on top of 32:14, 4 lines down, the new paragraph. V'anoichi haroyeh. The S'dei Chemed, amongst his everything else, his unbelievable, absolute brilliance, is also poetic. This is the way much of rabbinic literature is written. So it's a takeoff on a verse that Samuel the prophet said. He's saying, V'anoichi haroyeh, and I, the seer. So he's saying, now, what I think, what I see, says the S'dei Chemed, Shegam Maran Muharita Besifra the Rabbi Avahu Keheles Yaakov B'Tesefes the Rabbanon Mareches Aches Ois Kuf Lamed Zayin Daf Men Vav Amud Gimel Mitfus Ashkenaz Shnas Rabbeinu Muhari Al-Gazi Zichroinu L'Chayolim Abba. All right, he's bringing down another contemporary of his. And he's just telling us exactly where it is, in which edition, which print. Amad b'chakira zu. So he too is addressing this question. B'mai pligi Rambam, with what Maimonides is arguing, the soiver that he holds, the loinem reshirin leven noyach. Im ha-toisves b'chulin daf lamed gimel hanal. The muchach shesoivim shegam leben noyach nem rashirin. So it comes out, according to Maimonides, all of these measurements were not given, do not apply to bnei noyach. And for them, any amount is forbidden, and likewise, the punishment. There's nothing to do with kezayis for ben noyach. Whereas Tosfos, that we were just quoting from Tractate Chulin, they hold that the measurements are for bnei noyach as well. So he says like this: the muchach shesoivrim. It's clear. You must say that the Tosfos commentary hold shegam leven noyach nem rashiurim, that for the bnei noyach as well, all of these measurements, such as a kezayis, were also given over, were also taught. Shelechoira, that seemingly yesh litmoya. We are bewildered. We can ask. Deha amrinon shiurin halachalon meshim Sinai. We say that all these measurements are part of the oral tradition given over to Moses. V'chevan halacha nischat shel Yisrael me'ayin lanu leimar duadin biven noyach. And since the whole point of halacha here is, of this oral tradition, that it was something which is new. It's a novelty given specifically for the Jew. In the written law, God does not give any prescribed amount when he says, eat this or don't eat that. However, he says it orally to Moses. That only applies to Jews. That's the whole point. So where would we come off saying that it applies to Bnei Noach as well? Why? The Chasav, so when he wrote this particular individual that we're quoting, V'zel Shoinoi. Here's what he wrote, and we quote. V'ulai, perhaps we can say, the Rambam v'Tosfos, that Maimonides and the Tosfos, Pligi, are arguing, B'sfaras hara'am, in what is the understanding of the ra'am that we mentioned. The Rambam soiver distam achila b'choldehu. Now, we're getting a little bit technically philosophical within Jewish law. When you say eat, to eat something, what is technically eating, without explaining what is meant by human consuming food. What does that mean? So we say, without explaining and without getting into detail, any amount would be called eating. Ella, it's just rather, the Asya Hilchasa, comes along this oral tradition that was given to Moses, and it takes it out, so to say, of its simple, straightforward implication in order to punish. So it says, oh, there's a special amount in order to get punished. But the way to look at it is, eating is anything. The smallest sliver of food that was put into your mouth and swallowed, consumed by you, that's called eating. However, and therefore you would be punished for that if it's forbidden. However, comes along this special halakha, the oral tradition that God told Moses, no punishment until the individual eats a kazayis. Avali surah, but as far as the prohibition is concerned, kidekai kai, as it stands, it stands. Tafilu b'chol shu, that even if he eats the smallest amount, much less than a kazayis, it's still forbidden. That's one way of looking at it. V'im kain, and if so, that's how we're going to look at it. That eating is eating. And the halacha comes and tells us, but as far as the punishment is concerned, for that I've given you a required amount. If so, since this halacha, this law, is only for the Jew, that he doesn't get punished unless he eats a certain amount. So then, let's turn now to the Ben Noyach, the non-Jew. What's called eating for him? Same as eating for the Jew. Any amount. The slightest sliver of food is eating. And therefore, if something is forbidden, he can't eat any amount. And he is also obligated and punishable for eating that amount, because the halakha l'Moshe Sinai has nothing to do with the Ben Noyach. So what remains is what would have been the case by the Jew as well, if not for this special oral tradition. A Jew would have also been punished for eating the slightest amount. It's just that God told Moses, no punishment until they eat a kazayis. But that was only said about Jews. So what remains is that for a Ben Noyach, eating is eating, and therefore, since he's not allowed to eat it, and since there's a certain penalty for eating, there you go. Because this halacha was not innovated as far as they are concerned for the non-Jew. However, the commentary of Tosfos, what do they hold? The inyan halacha, that this tradition, this oral law given to Moses, did not come for the punishments, to say that there's no punishment until one eats a kazayis, but rather, this is what God said to Moses. This is the way we have to read it. That whenever it speaks in the Torah about eating, when you say eat something or don't eat something, how do you categorically define eating? What's the biblical meaning of eat, food? What does that mean? Kazayis. It has to be that amount. In other words, eating less than a kazayis is not really eating. For example, call it tasting or something of that nature. It's not really eating. Someone asks you, did you eat today? Say, no, I didn't eat. Say, oh, I saw. You had half a grape. Come on, that's eating. Well, you know, gotta be honest. Person means they didn't really eat. He didn't say, he didn't feast. Okay, so what's the amount? So that's exactly what the halacha is, that God told Moses that the amount of eating is a very specific amount, and less than that amount is not called eating. And that being the case, Af Bazharas ben Noyach. So when it comes to the prohibition for the non-Jew to have Yabilashen Achila, where it also speaks in the language of eating, God says that B'nai Noyach may not eat certain things. He bechazayis. So of course, it's a kazayis as well. Why not? Torah is defining eating. So that's how we're looking at it. Torah is defining eating. Okay, so eating is eating. Less than that is not eating. So then for the ben noach as well, less than that isn't eating. The kevan is halacka. That since the halacha came along, and yes, of course, we agree that the halacha is for the Jew. But in this case, what is the halacha? What is this oral tradition? The mishpat loshen achila, that technically speaking, the language of achila, of eating, b'chazayis, b'chol ha-Torah, is a kazayis throughout the entire Torah. Hi hadin b'achilo hamura b'ben noyach hu b'chazayis. Same thing when it comes to ben noyach, no different. Zeh nir de liyashiv k'tzas ad kan l'shen nisham. This is how it seems to be able to somewhat clarify, and this is the end of the quote. So he suggests that the argument between Maimonides, the Rambam, and the Tosfos commentary really boils down to how to look at this, and that will really tell us why they argue about a ben noyach, whether there is a measurement or there isn't a measurement. According to Maimonides, any amount is called eating, and for the Jew, there's a special innovation. God tells Moses, no punishment unless they eat a certain amount. Okay, it's a certain leniency. Didn't redefine eating. Can't eat, you're not allowed to eat. So a Jew is forbidden from having a very, very, very tiny amount of, let's say, pork. Is he to be punished for that amount? No, not until he eats, so to say, an ounce or so. Okay? A non-Jew is not to eat Eiver min achai, part of an animal that came off that animal before, and eats a very, very small amount. He ate it. And since this whole thing of kazayis has nothing to do with a non-Jew, whatever the punishment is, that's it. He transgressed. That's the Rambam's view. Tosfos says no, on the contrary. Torah says don't eat. We don't know the definition of what the Torah means when it says eat or don't eat. What's eating? So comes along this oral tradition and teaches us God's meaning and his definition of the word eat. And that is a specific measurement. Oh, so now we know what it means when the Torah says don't eat. Which means that less than that is not even eating. And it's not even forbidden. And for the Jew, why is it still forbidden? Because we have a special word that says kol. So it teaches us that even if you ate less than eating, you still transgressed, but no punishment, because you didn't eat. But even if you just tasted, no good. Forbidden. But for the non-Jew, it doesn't say that word kol, so they're left with the definition of eating, which is kazais. That's the way the Tosfos looks at it. ובדפוס ישן הוא דף למד חס עמד א' כמו שמספר מדברי הרב מר עיניים על דברי התוספות בחולין דף למד ג' דיבר מסטל אחד מדברי הרב אורך השולחן סימן סמך בייס אויס ה'. All right. Just in the parentheses, he's telling us about in an older print where it is. And then he mentions where to look in another book. Amar HaMechaber. Now, parenthetically, says the S'dei Chemed, the author says, meaning himself, this is a note of his, Ma shichasti dvarim elu lemaran Maharita bar brei de Ravin Chasida HaMechaber Keheles Yaakov lav b'firusha itmar elo midakasu bereish ois kuf lamed zayin hanal Amar HaKosef shepisroinoi hu Amar hachin kamuvan. Okay, saying the fact that I said all of this and I attributed it to that certain individual, he doesn't really say so explicitly, but it's I understood it from what he said. All right. V'tam zeh shekosvo rabbanim hanal, l'svaras harambam, kosvo gam b'sefer edus b'yosef hamuv lahalon v'diber maskil v'ikar klolim. U'v'sefer chodosh. Okay, so he says like this. And this explanation that we just gave, so it's also brought down in another authoritative book. Over Sefer Chadash, and in a new book, Ra'isi, I saw Shekosav Sharad Baz al Rambam Kosav Vadavar Yodua Dechol Ashirin Allah Cholomeisha Misinai, that the Radbaz, one of the commentaries on Maimonides, on the Rambam, he writes that it's known that all of these measurements are oral law given to Moses at Sinai. And anything which is halacha mishum Sinai was only given for the Jews. And over there he speaks a little bit more about this as well, just a bit. Next paragraph. Umasha Kosav b'Sefer Chodesh Anal, and that which it says in this new book that I mentioned, Liyashev Divir Argoin Tzlach, where he wants to reconcile the words of the Tzlach that we brought down earlier on the Rambam. Alpi Mashihim Tzitam L'Chalek, based on that which he came up, he produced a reason to make a distinction, L'Inyan Shiur, as far as measurements are concerned, Bein Shari Sur in the Korban Pesach. The Tzlach came up with this big innovation, and he wanted to make a difference between all other prohibitions and the Paschal offering. That all other prohibitions, a non-Jew may not eat any amount. The Paschal offering is different, and that the non-Jew also only transgresses, is only forbidden from a kizayis. Kaniz Kalel is mentioned above. Hine lo yehiro tzimoinenu bazeh. Lo yehir vatzimoinenu bazeh. Well, he did not quench our thirst when it comes to this. The milvad dakate kosher halagoin tzlach. Besides the fact that it's still difficult, on the words of this great genius, the tzlach. Mima sharam bam b'mitzvos lo yisasei kuf chavches mono mitzvah zu. As we brought down last class, earlier here, that in the Sefer HaMitzvahs of Maimonides, in prohibition number 128, the Rambam says, he mentions this prohibition, that we, the Jews, are not allowed to feed the Paschal offering meat to a non-Jew. V'im deho azhara ksuva b'Torah hilaven neicher atzmoi ma inyan zu levin targag mitzvahs shenemar l'Yisrael. How can you say that it's upon the non-Jew when it says we can't give him a kazayas, which was the whole thing that the Rambam said, and from that you want to learn out that the non-Jew is only forbidden from eating kazayas? So what room would there be for this to be commandment number 128 or any commandment of the 613 for the Jew? If the whole point is we're focusing on the non-Jew, he's not allowed to eat it, and how much can't he eat? Then it's not a mitzvah of the Jew. It's one of the 7 Noachide commandments. And as we discussed, then it should be 8, whatever. And then they gave an answer. They say, really, it is one of the 7. Or really, it is an 8th. And the reason now it's not an 8th, if you recall from last time, is because all of those apply all the time and everywhere. And this one only applies once a year, and it only applies when you have the Paschal offering. But it really is only for them. That doesn't make sense, because the Rambam, in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, in his 613 commandments, the book that he writes, the 613 commandments for the Jew, he lists over there, number 128, that the Jew is not allowed to feed it to the non-Jew. A ben nechar is not Jewish, or it's a Jew that converted out. Furthermore, even if we were to admit that there is room to make this difference, let's take this approach of the tzlach for a moment, and let's entertain this idea that yes, there's a difference for Bnei Noach between all other prohibitions of eating and the Paschal offering. All other prohibitions, any amount is forbidden. The Korban Pesach is unique, it's different, has to be a kazayis, just like for a Jew. Let's say that for a moment. Mikol Makoim, kashe, but it's still difficult. Minole Rabbeinu, from where does our teacher, referring to Maimonides, where does he get din zeh, this law? Sheim be'emes yadanu eiz makar b'divrei Razal b'shas pavli v'Yerushalmi v'kayetze shebekorban Pesach kam leven necher azari b'chazayis haynu chaynu leimar the tam lahavdala shebein shar yisron l'korban Pesach k'mei shekasa b'sefer anal. What's the source of Maimonides? Where does he get this from? The Tzlach is building it on the words of Maimonides. That he says that a Jew is not allowed to give a kezayis to the non-Jew. And the Tzlach wants to say, based on his understanding of the words of the Rambam there, that you see there's a difference for Bnei Noyach between all other prohibitions and the Korban Pesach. Let's say that's so. The Rambam can't make up such a thing. He doesn't make up laws. So what's his source? In the entire Talmud, the Babylonian, the Jerusalem Talmud, where does he get that? Where do we find in the words of the oral tradition of the rabbis anywhere such a concept that for a Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, a non-Jew is only forbidden from eating a kezayis or more, but not less? Aval kol sheloi nimtzu l'Rabbi Seinu b'alei Talmud. But as long as we cannot find from our rabbis, the authors of the Talmud, she'omru, that said she'azaras habenecha b'achilas Pesach hirak al kezayis, that the prohibition for a non-Jew to partake and eat from the Paschal offering is only a kezayis. Mihigid lanu lidreish taima dikra lahakel. So who is to tell us to be able to try to interpret the reason of the verse to be lenient? We're reinterpreting the verse. We don't do that. We need the oral law. We need Talmud in order to know how to derive any law from the verses in the written law, in the Bible. So how can we say that we're being lenient on the Ben Noyach, and we're saying, no prohibition until he eats a kezayis? Ve'ein hamoishit loy pachas mikezayis oiver belifnei iver. And therefore, the Jew that extends to this non-Jew less than a kezayis of the meat of the Paschal offering is not transgressing lifnei iver, which is don't put a stumbling block before a blind man, which we said is a whole discussion as well. Does that apply between for a Ben Noyach or for a Jew to a Ben Noyach? Because a Jew to a Jew is not allowed to cause another Jew to transgress. So right now we're saying very simply, of course, a Jew can't cause a Ben Noyach to transgress one of his sins. In other words, if a Ben Noyach wants to murder someone, he just doesn't have a weapon, the Jew is forbidden to supply him with that weapon, because you are assisting him in committing his transgression. So too over here. If a Ben Noyach can't eat the Paschal offering, so the Jew can't give it to him, fine. But now you're saying, but since it's only kezayis, there's nothing wrong with the Jew giving the Ben Noyach less than a kezayis. We have an established rule. We do not interpret, derive the reason of verses to be lenient. And furthermore, Sharama Bilchis Melachim, Maimonides, all the way in the Laws of Kings, which is primarily where he speaks about the 7 Noachide commandments over there, the end of his magnum opus of the Mishnah Torah, in the Laws of Kings. He shouldn't have just left it unexplained. There, he says that these measurements were not given to Bnei Noach. There he says it, just like that. He shouldn't have left it so I don't know if it's ambiguous, but so general, and just say, measurements were not given for Bnei Noach. The mashma, because that implies, the bechol masha ben Noach muzhar, olav, that anything that the non-Jew, that the Ben Noach has commanded not to eat or whatever, chayav bechol shu, he is liable for any amount, because Rambam says that there is no shiurim for them. Maimonides should have excluded, he should have taken out of this rule, achilas ha-pesach, eating of the Paschal offering. He should have said there, this is one exception, that he does not transgress unless he eats a kazayas. Finally, comment with the Maskul Vidah. The fact that the Rambam didn't say it there is a bit problematic, if that's what he really holds. Bottom of the right-hand column, uveikar. Uveikar klolin should, in general, the main point is like this. Shadas HaRambam, the opinion of Maimonides, shaloi nemru shiurin levin Noach. Right? That's what he says explicitly, that the measurements, kezayis, etc., were not given for the non-Jews. With regards to that, kosav Maran Marita Sham B'Kahelis Yaakov Hanal. Quoting again this book that he brought down earlier, he writes like this: Shemotza, that he found l'Rabbeinu HaMeiri B'Ksivas Yad, that he found from our teacher the Meiri. The Meiri was one of the early commentators. He lived maybe a little bit after the Rambam. He was a Rishon, which means that he lived close to 1,000 years ago. So the Meiri, in a manuscript, not in a printed volume, no, he wrote commentaries, and it's the name of it is Beis HaBechira on the Talmud, and this is his commentary on the Talmud. So this person found a manuscript, the Perek Gid HaNoshe, particular chapter in Tractate Chulin, Shekosav, that the Meiri wrote, Bipshitus, simply, Kedas HaRambam, like the opinion of the Rambam, the Ben Noach Chayav B'chol Shu, that a Ben Noach is liable for any amount. Uvma Shekosva Rabbanim and his Karm Leil, Shein King Das HaToisvis B'chulin Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph, Tiber Maskal Echad, and that which these other rabbis wrote, that this is not the opinion of the Tosfos, they don't agree with that. V'chein kosav hagoyim m'loy haroyim b'marechas ben Noach ois tesvav b'das ha-Tosfos anal, and likewise another commentary writes in his understanding of the Tosfos that Tosfos does not agree with the Rambam. V'chein nokit b'pshitus hagoyim chasan soifer b'daf kuf mem amud dalud toich ois chafei. And likewise, another one, a much more recent commentator, also wrote, Vihu midikasvu, from the fact that they wrote, Av al gav, the chavase, asur b'mashu, basar v'gidim v'atzames, v'yisrael loy mitzar elu b'chazais basar v'chulu. I'm sorry, the Kusi. Sorry. Again. Afal Gav, second to last line. Even though the Kusi, basically a non-Jew, Asur b'mashu, he's not allowed to eat any amount. Whether it's basar, the actual flesh, the meat, the gidim, the veins, vatzomis, the bones, the Yisrael, but the Jew, he's only forbidden from eating a kezayis of meat. The mashma that implies the gam lekusi ika shi'ura, that also for the non-Jew there is a measurement, there is an amount. V'ha'evdol shebeinu levein Yisrael hu, the difference between the non-Jews' prohibition and the Jews is the kusi chayav al kezayis she'einoi mi basar bilvad elahu imo atzomis v'gidin. The kusi, the non-Jew, in order for him to be liable, it needs to be a kezayis, but it's not just flesh. If he eats meat together with the bones and the veins, and all of that together equals the kezayis, for the non-Jew that would be considered kezayis. And the Jew, though, for him to be liable for the punishment of eating the Paschal offering, or whatever he's not allowed to eat, or whatever the case is, it would be only the meat, not together with the bones and so on. Because if you don't say that, they shouldn't have elaborated so much. They should have just simply said that even though a kusi is chayav, is obligated for any amount, and a Yisrael, a Jew, has to be at least a kezayis. So, didn't write it like that. That shows us that, in fact, there is an amount for a kusi. It's just there's a difference between the Jew and the non-Jew as far as how you get to the kezayis. Hine hagoin mislonim b'shalus v'tshuvas edus b'yosef siman vav anaftes kam hu chashav b'tchilo shatois v'sanal chilkim im Rambam. So he's bringing down another recent sage who he initially also thought that the Tosfos are disagreeing with the Rambam. And he thought that the Tosfos hold that the measurements are also for Bnei Noach, and that Kezayis applies for Ben Noach. The Shuv Kasav, and then he wrote, the Beguf HaDavar im Ben Noach Metzuve Apochis Mikeshiur Yesh Leimer de Toli Beplukta the Rabbi Yochanan V'Reish Lakish Bechatzi Shiur. And then he says like this: whether or not a Ben Noach is commanded not to eat even less than the Kezayis, is there such a prohibition for him, actually is dependent on the argument in the Talmud between two sages in the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, with regards to half a Kezayis, which doesn't literally mean 50%. It means less than a Kezayis. Any amount less than a Kezayis. Is that prohibited for the Jew? There's an argument in the Talmud between two sages. Everybody agrees that the punishment is only from a kezayis. Question is, biblically, is it forbidden for a Jew to eat even less than a kezayis or not? And here's their argument. To the Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, mistaber loimar, it makes sense to say, tistam achila, that when you say eat, moire b'cholshu, that's any amount. And comes along the tradition, and it's telling us even though he ate, but he doesn't get punished unless he eats a certain amount called the kezayis. V'im kain, if that's the case, it's according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's still forbidden for the Jew to eat less than the kezayis amount. It's still prohibited. If so, the oivid kechavim, when it comes to the non-Jew, the loishayach had divrei Kabbalah, where obviously this tradition of the kezayis does not apply to him. So he obviously is commanded not to eat even less than the amount of the measurement of the kezayis. Hein li'isur v'hein lo'inish, both as far as the prohibition goes as well as the punishment. Loichein l'reish lakish, but this is not so according to the other opinion of the Talmud. According to Reish Lakish, Reish Lakish holds that biblically, for a Jew, anything which is forbidden, less than the amount, less than the kezayis, is 100% permissible, biblically. So according to Reish Lakish, a Jew would be allowed to eat a little sliver of bacon. Biblically, not talking about it rabbinically. But. So that's the argument of Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish. Is less than a kezayis forbidden for the Jew or permitted, biblically? L'didei, so according to him, according to Reish Lakish, stam achila b'chezayis. That means that the halakha, this oral tradition, is teaching us not just that it's some leniency and God is being nice, so to say, and he says, you know what, it's all forbidden, but I won't punish him until he eats the kezayis. No, he's defining eating for us. And it's not called eating till you add a kezayis. V'im kein, if so, kan ben noyach einu mitzuveh rak b'chazayis. If so, the ben noyach is also not commanded, only a kezayis. V'im kein, if so, after it's possible to lahachinakti atoisvis b'lashoinam, that for this reason the toisvis say in their language kezayis pasur v'gidim v'atzomos. Why do they say a kezayis of meat and bones and veins? Because so that their question could be even according to Reish Lakish. Because the main question of the Tosfos ain't rak l'Reish Lakish. It's not only according to Reish Lakish. To the Rabbi Yechon Gamli Yisrael also chatzishim deraisa mishum tuma. Because according to Rabbi Yechanan, for a Jew, even less than a kezayis is biblically forbidden. Okay, the Mitar Tzisham. The Iker Kushiyasam Rak Reish Lakish. Their main question is only according to Reish Lakish. Ulachitirtzu to the Rabbi Yechanan Vada Yena Kasha, and therefore Taisus answers that according to Rabbi Yechanan it's surely not difficult. Well, the Reish Lakish nitzrach letavritz delays leach pircha leikar v'chulu. And they had to then come on to a whole different explanation how to get around that it shouldn't be difficult according to Reish Lakish. V'im kein, if so, l'didan, according to us, the Chaim alon ki Rabbi Yechanan. What's the final verdict? What do we hold in this argument in the Talmud between Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish, as far as the Jews concerned, as far as what is prohibited? So we hold like Rabbi Yechanan, the chatzi shiras min atera, that even less than the kezayis is biblically forbidden. So that means that Tosfos also, they agree that a ben noyach is commanded on even less than a measurement. Rambam, like the opinion of the Rambam, Eilu toiref divrei kodshoy. This is the gist of his holy words. In other words, it is not a dispute between the Rambam and Tosfos as far as whether a ben noyach is allowed to eat less than a kezayis. V'chidushu shelo hizkir divrei aprim megadim v'ginas v'radim v'roish yosef hanal. And it's kind of unusual that he doesn't mention these other sources that we said. And you will see Sefer Minchas Moshe liyedidia Rav Agoyin av Bezdin Kilas Kaminka Yishmer Tzurim v'Chaskim Chelik Yerideo Simen Dalado Is Yud Parperes No Binyan Zeh. Then he tells us another place to look from another person, he says, who is my friend, who wrote about this. And he writes there, Gamhu, he also writes the din zeh, that this law, im nemru shiur livnei noach, whether measurements were given to bnei noach or not, tali b'plukta to Rabbi Yechanan v'Reish Lakish b'chatzi shiur. He also writes over there, like we just said now, that it really depends on this argument between Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish whether chatzi shiur, less than the kezayis, is forbidden for the Jew. Biblically, that's what it would depend on whether we have measurements for non-Jews. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yechanan, which it's forbidden for a Jew to eat even less than the kezayis, that means to say that for non-Jews, less than a kezayis. And according to Reish Lakish, where it's permitted for a Jew to eat less than a kezayis, that means that for non-Jews, it would be the same. And since we do say like Rabbi Yochanan, that less than a kazayis is biblically forbidden for the Jew. Shapir Pasuk Rambam, then the Rambam rules very nicely. The true, the measurements were not given to Bnei Noach. It's only for the Jew. And then he found that it was written like this also in another book. So what we're saying right now is that it really depends whether or not Bnei Noach are commanded and are punished for eating less than a kezayis, depends on the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And since the final verdict is that we follow Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, which says that less than a kezayis is biblically forbidden for the Jew, that means to say that measurements were not given for the non-Jew, and therefore they are commanded and forbidden to eat less than a kezayis, and the punishment for it is the same, unlike by the Jew, where the punishment is only if he ate a kezayis. So we're going to leave it at this point, even though we're still really in the middle over here, until next time, and wishing everybody much success in the study, and most of all in the observance and adherence of the 7 Noachide commandments, and spreading the word in order to prepare for the great day which is unfolding before our very eyes, the complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach with the complete and true redemption now. Thank you.